housing crisis, economic crisis, or merely a financial crisis? I sound probably somewhat calm. For all the talk of crisis, what if the crisis is a label, a way of relating to something? What if there is a possibility of simply noticing changing patterns as changing patterns? This audio I'm going to read from my blog. The pictures that are on the blog are pretty important to this audio, and I don't plan to connect them to the video, so make sure you go to jrfibonacci.wordpress.com and search for housing crisis, economic crisis, or merely our financial crisis, and view these images along with listening to the audio. There is no housing crisis, at least not in most of the world. There are housing crises in various places, but there are plenty of houses available for use that are currently unused in places like Mesa, Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, even Greece and Ireland. There's plenty of houses. The same is true of commercial buildings. There's lots of them. A lot of them are empty, but that's not a crisis. If you were in a hailstorm and it was like 20 degrees outside or something and you didn't have a house, that would be a housing crisis right there. So which of the following images show a housing crisis? There is an abandoned building or two in a ghost town in Australia. At the top, it's got the ivy, the vines look like spider webs crawling up the side of it there. Then the next picture, it's stretched all weird, but it's a picture of a housing development in Idaho, that a real estate development that has been abandoned since 2008. They put some insulation in, and it's been sitting there for a few years. Got it fenced to keep people out, and I don't even know if that's accurate. A lot of these images, I just grab them off of the internet and throw whatever caption was already on the page where I found it. The next image is a bunch of for sale signs and for rent or for let signs in Great Britain. They'll say for lease or for let instead of for rent, apparently. So you got a row in an urban neighborhood, a row of for sale signs there. Is that a housing crisis? How about this next one, a suburban neighborhood in the U.S., a bunch of for sale signs? That's not really a crisis, that's just a surplus of houses. Now here we go. Here's a village in Burma. Before and after pictures after the village has been devastated by fire. On the left, there are houses. On the right, there's no houses left. That's a housing crisis. Here's the incineration of Hiroshima, Japan by bomb. I didn't show any before pictures here, but just trust me, there used to be buildings there where you see all those scraps of wood. That used to be buildings. Acres and acres of buildings were destroyed with one bomb. That's a housing crisis. I mean, on the other hand, there weren't any people left to need housing so much. But anyway, here's I know these are... I'm not going to apologize for what I just said, but I do want to acknowledge the point of what I'm saying is a crisis has to have people in crisis and relating to something as a crisis and having a serious, real, practical, economic challenge. That would be an economic crisis. Like, I used to have a house and I don't, but I'm still alive. Okay, that's a crisis. For someone who's cold or has hailstones pounding on them or something, right? Even wind. Those are real practical issues, but to have a building that has a lock on it, if I've locked my key out of my own house, that's a crisis, but it's not a financial crisis, and it's not an economic crisis. It's just like I've locked myself out, and we could say, it's a crisis, fine, but it's just what kind of crisis is it? If I lock myself out of my car, or if I lock myself out of my house, and I have to call my neighbor who has an extra key or whatever, or call my landlord. Well, that's not too big of a crisis, really. Now here's a picture of New Orleans at the Astrodome after Hurricane Katrina. It's pretty much a bunch of cots down there, but you can see the people in the midst of the cots. There's a few hundred people shown in that picture. Probably at least 1,000 cots in that picture, but you had lots of people who they had a housing crisis because they had all these people and no houses. So they got all their cots out, and it was a good thing they had a bunch of cots. Next image is from Haiti. It's a picture of a bunch of tents and a few people. And what happened basically there was an earthquake, and about 1.5 million people, that's 1,500,000 people, lost their homes pretty suddenly after an earthquake. So that would be a housing crisis. There's 1.5 million people that don't have homes that used to. Here's a tent. Here's a cot. Here's a lollipop. That's a crisis. If you have 1.5 million people that had housing and then suddenly don't, that's a housing crisis. So let's be clear that a housing crisis is completely distinct from a housing surplus like you have in Japan and the U.S. and parts of Europe. There's a whole lot of houses, and prices are so high that a lot of them are unoccupied. Commercial buildings, same thing. They're not being used. Okay, that's not the same kind of crisis, though. When there is a housing surplus in a particular locality or region, like a ghost town or anywhere where there's just tons of houses relative to the number of people, like after the Black Death and the plagues in Europe, you had like 1/3 of the population died out, but there were still all those buildings that used to be there. Well, that was a housing surplus. So when you have a housing surplus in a particular area, the value of houses tends to fall relative to the value of other things, such as food prices or fuel prices or prices of stocks, of the ownership of private businesses. That's not a housing crisis. That's a decline in housing prices that's a predictable result of a housing surplus. It could be, though, that there's a financial crisis, especially for those individuals who have speculatively gambled on financed real estate investments. Their choices may be punished by the natural consequences of severe financial loss. They gambled with debt. They lost their home. There you go. It's like before there was insurance companies. If you build a house out of wood, like in that Three Little Pigs story or whatever it is, and then it burns down. Okay, your house is burned down. You don't have a house anymore. Or there's an earthquake. Okay, it's gone. You don't have a house now. That's a crisis. If the insurance company goes out of business and can't pay you for what they said they would pay you on their policy, well, then you got another issue right there. But you got a house or not? You have access to it or not? People who have gambled their finances on mortgages, some of them did pretty well. Some of them didn't do so well. That's how gambling goes. You win some, you lose some. Getting out at the right time is important, and knowing the odds of the game you're playing also can be relevant to the results of gambling. So when a personal financial crisis results from unsuccessful gambling on real estate, that is certainly not a large-scale housing crisis, as in a shortage of housing. That's just a personal financial crisis. Even when a financial credit bubble shrinks or deflates, that is at most a financial crisis that's resulting in a sudden redistribution of affluence from debtors to creditors. That's what a deflation of a credit bubble is. That's not an actual economic crisis. It just means the ownership changes. Now these people who used to own homes and had $100,000 of equity, well, they don't have any equity, they lost it all, and now they have to rent. They don't own the homes anymore. But the homes are still there. The homes didn't get burned down. They didn't fall into a hole in an earthquake. The homes are still there. That's just a financial crisis, not an economic crisis. So an economic crisis would be things like a shortage of food, a shortage of fuel, or even a shortage of housing. Rising prices are not an economic crisis. Falling prices are not an economic crisis either. But when housing prices were rising exponentially prior to recent years, those rising prices were not an economic crisis. Rising prices of housing, the housing boom, it wasn't a crisis. It was a boom. Currently, as fuel prices approach their 2008 highs, that's not an economic crisis either. Gasoline prices are currently over $10 per gallon again in the UK, and that has resulted in an economic shift as people spend more on priority fuel expenses and less on things like housing or recreation or travel. They're just reallocating their budget to adjust to the rising price of gasoline because they demand gasoline increasingly and relative to the supply. So less gasoline is available and demand is rising. It's not so much a currency, fluctuation issue as far as the euro or British pound or US dollar, any of those things. It's just prices are rising for gasoline relative to things like toothpicks and cell phones and computers and cars and houses and stocks. So that was the basic point, that people would just, they would value and give priority to things like gasoline, so that would create a shift in spending patterns. They would stop putting so much money into rent and real estate and cars and stuff and start spending more on fuel as fuel continued to rise. And I predicted that rise, and I made reference to the natural set of consequences in a 2004 article called The Real U.S. Deficit, Oil, as distinct from the nominal currency-based deficit as a number of dollars. The real U.S. deficit was 14 million barrels per day of oil as of 2004 that were being imported. And one section of that 2004 article I titled The Domino Effect. And I show an image of that below. There's the question in blue. How many dollars will it cost to buy a gallon of gasoline next year? That was kind of the key question of the whole article. Actually, you know what? The real U.S. deficit oil was in 2005. 2004. Oh, no. Yeah. Okay. Let me clarify the point I just made. So it was in 2004, the real U.S. deficit oil, that I wrote that. In 2005, I wrote another thing called Worth Its Weight in Oil, to reference the hysteria that people had about metals and other commodity prices rising, like fuel prices. Like food prices, relative to the much more important issue of fuel, gasoline, oil, fuel. So worth its weight in oil was a play on the term worth its weight in gold. Gold is, of course, of no great importance practically. But every day, millions of people in the U.S., I think millions, I'm not sure, go to gas stations to get gasoline. You just don't have that much interest in gold. So back to the 2004 article with the image there on my blog. The domino effect, I showed that first instance from 2004, and that's in blue. Under that, the next paragraph's in blue also. Before detailing predictable consequences for the U.S. economy and consumers, here is some history. Reviewing historic trends, perhaps useful patterns will be evident. Further, what is predictable for the U.S. has already happened elsewhere. And I talked there in the image, you'll see references to Texas and the Houston Oilers and the boom of the U.S. and the boom of Texas as an oil-rich area. But I believe later in the article when I say what's predictable for the U.S. has already happened elsewhere, I may refer to Japan. I'm not 100% sure. I don't recall, but Later in this blog, in this audio, I'll refer to Japan's last 22 years to 23 years. There's an image of some dominoes with a kind of a maroon title, and it says below the domino oil effect, it says below that, how I knew by 2004 that worldwide production of crude oil was peaking, plus how peak oil would predictably affect gas prices, then budgets, then trends in spending and lending, then prices of stocks and real estate, in other words, behavior in spending and lending and buying and selling and borrowing, that would affect prices of things like real estate and stocks. And that would affect the stability of Europe, the US, the Mideast, and so on. And there's a link to the dominoileffect.com there. So if there is a large-scale economic crisis in the world today, it is simply the redistribution of affluence away from places that used to dominate economically, like the UK, Germany, and Japan, towards places that have the most valued resources, like OPEC. The Japanese stock market there I show, that was an image I made in 2011, so it says 21 years instead of 22 anyway. The Japanese stock market is still down about 80% after 21 years of, quote, recession. How long are recessions? That's an ironic statement. So you can see the picture of the Japanese stock market's decline of the last couple of decades. Next image is a image of oil production, and it's divided into two regions. There's the non-OPEC group and the OPEC group. So there's two lines, and you'll see that in 2008, this was a forecast prior to 2008, that in 2008 it was forecast that oil production in the non-OPEC countries of the former Soviet Union, the United States, and so on, would fall below the oil production of the OPEC countries forever, for the rest of time, for the rest of history. You can see 2020 and 2040 where there's the, you can get a sense of the ratio. Instead of being a 1-to-1 ratio in 2008, the balance will shift towards OPEC and then really, really shift towards OPEC, according to that geology research. Back to the black text. In the 20th century, the US and the USSR rose from relative obscurity to be the two dominant superpowers of global economics. Why? Was it similar political systems? No. Lots of other places also had political systems similar to either the US or the USSR. So those other places didn't rise to global superpower status. So it wasn't, if you had like 6 places that rose to global superpower status all on this, they just changed their political system and they all rose together, that would be notable, but that's not what happened at all. So what did the US and USSR have in common? Well, the US was the #1 producer of oil in the world for most of the 20th century. The #2 oil producing region for most of the 20th century was the USSR, and that geographic region is now referenced as the former Soviet Union, or FSU. In the chart below, the red line goes with the former Soviet Union, so you can see back into the 40s, 50s, 60s, that's during the period of time when it was called the Soviet Union, and then at a certain time they continued the line and now call it the former Soviet Union by just adding together the oil production of all those countries that are now separate countries, separate jurisdictions. You can see the USA peaked in its oil production around 1970, and just after that is when the Soviet Union, for the first time, became the top oil-producing country for an extended period. In fact, I say that's the first time they became the top oil-producing country for an extended period, because I believe in the early 20th century they briefly did have higher oil production than the U.S. So as you'll notice, the history of the 20th century is pretty much the history of the U.S. and the USSR coming to prominence, and the other powers like Japan, Germany, and UK losing prominence. Japan maybe isn't a good one to include there because they weren't huge in the 19th century, but they certainly you saw Hong Kong and Japan become significant economic powers in the 20th century, just not as significant as Germany and Britain were prior to the 20th century, nor as significant as the U.S. or Soviet Union were during the 20th century. So we have this picture of the oil. Japan is one of the most oil-dependent countries in terms of importing it. They have virtually no production and never have had much, and so they were really dependent on imports. The Soviet Union had an economic boom, of course, for quite a while, but it was waning by 1991. Their infrastructure, shifted so that they didn't have that large-scale bureaucracy in place. It broke apart into a bunch of smaller bureaucracies. Not that that's a horrible thing, just that, or that it's a good thing, just that the expansion of their culture and their economy as a unified economy, that stopped, and then different regions had more variety. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I do know that they started to use ruble in less and less places. The ruble currency became less and less utilized. Some other countries would issue their own currency that would be pegged to the ruble, but it wasn't the actual ruble coin or paper currency that was used there. So you had a big shift, similar to the shift that may be going on with the EU if it dissolves. Anyway, in the early 90s, the USSR's economic boom was waning. By 1989, Japan's economic boom was waning. But we're looking here at, I've kind of sidetracked myself. We're looking at the two top oil-producing regions of the planet in the 20th century, the USA and the USSR, or former Soviet Union now. And by 1999, the economic boom of the U.S. was showing signs of instability as well. It depends on exactly what statistics you look at. You can find signs of instability back in the 70s, but certainly by 1999, there were quite a few peaks and shifts. You had the airline sector of the United States stock market drop 40% in less than a year, starting in 1999, as global oil prices doubled in that same period of time. Perhaps related, the two things may be related, with airlines being one of the industries most sensitive to fuel prices. So, even though in '99 a lot of the U.S.'s economic boom was starting to destabilize and recede, a boom in borrowing extended the U.S. economy's boom temporarily, or the bubble. You could say that there was a boom up to that point, but then the speculative bubble really took off. And you could say the speculative bubble, you can trace it back to '82 or a variety of points of reference, 32. Depends on what trends and data you're looking at. Anyway, are you looking at GDP? You're looking at household debt to household income. There's a lot of ways to look at booms and bubbles. I don't want to get off into those kind of details. So, in '99, the economic boom of the U.S. was beginning to wane, according to certain statistics, certain stock market prices of certain industries, and so on. Certainly by 2000. From where did the U.S. borrow to fund that final speculative boom in housing and anything else? Well, to a great extent, the population of the U.S. and the government of the U.S. borrowed from its trading partners, from the U.S.'s trading partners. as in from those that the U.S. imported goods, such as Communist China, as well as the booming OPEC countries. So what is underway in Japan and the EU and the U.S.? A financial shift as in a shift in ownership. It's not a change in the number of houses or in the population, at least certainly not yet. That's possible, but it's not a war or a famine or a plague or anything, though that may arise in the future. For now, it's just a financial shift, as in a shift in ownership, or you could say a shift in access. So the ownership of companies in the U.S. and EU and Japan has shifted away from local domestic ownership within the country to ownership by the emerging foreign emerging new powers, these foreign countries and foreign parties, people, investors that are increasing in economic affluence, such as the Chinese and the Arabs. And as a note, the Chinese, when I say the Chinese, I don't just mean people within the borders of China, people in Hong Kong, people in San Francisco, anybody who is ethnically Chinese, I'm including in the reference I just made. And that's because the Chinese really, as a group of people, have a huge amount of wealth on this planet. The Chinese within China have less wealth than the Chinese that live outside of China, like in Malaysia and California and trying to think of other places where a bunch of Chinese people live. I don't know, Singapore, Hong Kong. So that data or that reference is derived from my reading of Asian Megatrends, I think was the name of the book. The 21st century is the century of Asia was kind of like the subtitle of that book. So what is underway in Japan, the U.S., and the EU? Well, there's a shift of ownership away from domestic ownership towards foreign ownership of the industries, the buildings, the real estate, and so forth. There's a shift away from domestic ownership towards ownership by foreigners. And of course, the pattern goes back and forth, different places. Lots of Americans were investing offshore. I know a guy who just recently bought a bunch of property in Mexico. A guy from Arizona in the U.S. bought a bunch of property in Mexico. So foreign ownership of property is just something that happens sometimes. The shift isn't really that there's less houses or a housing shortage. It's just who owns the houses. Who's going to be the landlord? Are there going to be people who own the houses themselves, or are they going to have to rent? So, my personal opinion is that most references to other issues besides the fact that this is not an economic crisis, it's not a housing crisis, it's just a shift in ownership, just a financial shift. You can call it a crisis. It's an implosion or deflation of the speculative bubble of credit, but that's really not that big a deal in certain ways, at least not for people who aren't upside down in mortgages and stuff. And there's a whole lot of people who are not upside down in mortgages, just so you know. So my personal opinion is that most references to other issues besides the fact that this is basically just a shift in the financial bubble, in a speculative bubble, I think those other references tend to be distractions for those who are unwilling or unable to recognize the simplicity of what is actually happening and has been happening for quite a while. I've been writing about it since early 2003. Creating political dramas such as controversies and promises of political solutions, rescues, bailouts. That stuff is the job of politicians, which they're hired and trained to perform, to create political dramas, to distract the mainstream public. Similar to the jobs of and training and so forth of professional wrestlers, or to actors, or agents of any other kind, whether they're agents of a government or a banking interest or whatever it may be. They're acting on behalf of some other party. They're agents of some other party. These figurehead politicians that are cultivated through the party system, that's not like a person who's written into the ballot, who funds their own campaign. The H. Ross Perot thing, that's not what we've got. We've got party politics. It's partisan politics. Partisan politics have dominated politics in Europe and North America for a long time. In Japan, in the 90s, you started to see such, after a long period of economic decline, and people started to get tired of all these promises made by all these politicians, and they had all these different prime ministers come and go really quickly. Then people started to write in other celebrities, especially comedians, political commentators that did like parody, kind of like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert. Well, those kind of folks in Japan not only got written in, they won elections, and with no campaigning. They didn't privately fund their campaign. They made an announcement. Their announcement spread through, grassroots conversations, and they were actually elected. And some of those politicians did things like they said they were elected on promises not to ever show up to work, not to ever do their job. They wouldn't, increase spending. They wouldn't even cash their own paycheck, and they would let the bureaucracy take its course. I don't even know to what extent all of those references that I just made are accurate, but I've read reports and accounts of that, and they certainly sound sensational, but I don't know. My understanding is that they're accurate. So, speaking of professional wrestlers, here's an actual segment from a pro wrestling TV show in 2008 called WWE, I believe, featuring Monday Night Raw? I forget which program it was. Anyway, featuring the campaigning of candidate Senator Barack Obama. That's a real wrestling TV show segment that Barack Obama did during his 2008 campaign. You can click it, and it's about a minute long, and listen to it. At the end, it bleeps out what he says, but he says, "Can you smell what Barack is cooking?" Which is a joke on this wrestler called The Rock, who says, "Can you smell what The Rock is cooking?" It's something he would say as part of his shtick, or part of his drama, his act. Well, Barack Obama is associating his presidential campaign with a professional wrestler's script, his act. There was a movie called Idiocracy that has even more of the analogy of professional wrestling to international politics and national politics explicitly played out in that movie. I liked it. So, I think it's by the guy who did Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I don't know if it was done by him, but I think one of the main actors is in both the movie Idiocracy and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Anyway, back to my blog. This has got to be the most rambly audio I've ever done. So, national and local politicians are agents of a larger drama. The myth of dictatorship is that a single patriarch is the entire issue. He's personally responsible for it all, such as Hitler or Pope Benedict, who formally announced the Holy Roman Inquisition of ritual human sacrifice and torture. Was the figurehead who announced something, even if that person was listed as the official author of it, was that figurehead perhaps also supported by a staff of advisors prior to the announcement, by ghostwriters, by a whole political party and machine, and even by lobbyists and funding sources that hire those lobbyists to influence the figurehead. So if there are empires and dynasties with a series of imperialist figureheads, then perhaps the entire bureaucracy that supports any particular figurehead has a functioning role in the activity known as imperialism. Perhaps we can't blame imperialism on any one particular historical figure. It's not Hitler in the 20th century. It's not Pope Benedict a few centuries ago. It's not, some Egyptian pharaoh. It's not somebody 4,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago or 9,000. There's no one person to blame for imperialism. Sorry. Was Woodrow Wilson personally responsible for the development of the Federal Reserve? Or was it Colonel House, his top advisor? Or was it a half dozen people? Or a few hundred? Or a few thousand? Or a few million? Look, it's been a system that's been going on for a long time with lots of participation by a lot of people. Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House were not the two people responsible for it. There's no one person, there's no two people, there's no six people. It's a whole development in human history. Pope Benedict did not personally perform the Inquisition. He had help. Hitler did not personally invade Poland or France. He had help too. There's these huge bureaucracies that conduct imperialism. I make reference to pirates sometimes. Any famous pirate, let's see, I'm trying to think. Blackbeard was an actual pirate. The captain of a pirate ship is not personally responsible for everything that happens on the ship, to the exception of all the other people who are participants on the crew. When a pilot flies an airplane, somebody had to build it. Somebody built runways and ramps and airports and stuff, developed the technology. The pilot isn't the only person. Sure, they're the figurehead. Sure, they're the functionary with a great practical role to perform. But Hitler, Pope Benedict, they're not personally responsible for all of imperialism or any particular instance of imperialism. They had help. So these people, Hitler, Pope Benedict, and all similar politicians, and I'm calling Pope Benedict a political figure because he was, those people merely were the mouthpieces for ripe social initiatives that obviously involved the cooperation of thousands of active participants who had to have some degree of support for the process that they participated in. So one individual is not solely responsible for the collaboration of thousands of people. That's why empires can last beyond the lifetime of a single founder or proponent, such as Comrade Lenin. So after Lenin's death, the USSR did not immediately dissolve. It continued. Other people came along. So otherwise, we could blame George Washington personally for the policies carried out in the name of the United States at My Lai during the invasion of Vietnam by the U.S. military in the 1960s, a few hundred years after George Washington's, military leadership climax. So blaming is the denial of responsibility. Beware of those who reject any responsibility for their own participation in social trends, social movements, economy. If somebody says this economy is the fault of that one prime minister or that one politician or George Washington or Pope Benedict or Hitler, well, that's kind of silly. Now, people may be very sincere about it. They may have a lot of agreement. A lot of people may all get together and deny personal responsibility on their own part and say, no, it's those other people or it's that other one person, and blame that party. That's possible. It's not going to necessarily help their financial situation or their economic situation. Next, I have a video link there from YouTube. Here's a message from World Wrestling Entertainment in 2008. This is from one of their broadcasts. This is a segment from another segment from World Wrestling Entertainment broadcast. And that one is on location at the Republican National Convention the presidential election hoopla. And it's repeating basically the same mentality as all other propaganda campaigns that encourage political activism and good citizenship through voting. If you click it, it's a minute and a half long. They repeat the same themes that you see throughout public education and every other channel, even cartoons for children. They present the heroism and loyalty demonstrated through voting. It's the right thing to do in a democracy. That's how it's presented. So, wrestling, the people who watch wrestling, which I watched, by the way, I used to be a huge fan of wrestling. People who watch wrestling and who watch other TV shows, they're given these messages that, the thing to do to demonstrate loyalty and to further your own economic interests is to vote in political campaigns and presidential election. So, like in that above, in that just referenced 2008 video of the WWE's promotion of participation in the Republican and Democratic Party's conventions and attention to those conventions, the masses are indoctrinated as to what trivial issues to heroically campaign for or against. Of course, to the passionate masses, those political issues are not labeled trivial, or by the passionate masses, they don't label political issues as trivial, not the ones they campaign for. But if successful, a campaign may produce a result that is not personally trivial, similar to a successful lawsuit. The campaign, people are sincere when they're campaigning. I'm just saying the actual outcome itself may be, well, how do I want to put this? The passage of laws and the passage of amendments and things like that, the coups and the revolutions, those aren't trivial, but maybe the way I phrased this wasn't really good. I knew that it was a little bit tricky when I was trying there, but the passion of the masses is directed by propaganda for economic purposes of the propagandists, and it's part of that larger bureaucracy. It's not Hitler. It's not the propaganda minister of Hitler. It's not just the bureaucracy that underneath it and the people that support it with taxes and so forth. It's everybody, but some of these issues may be distractions. They may be trivial. They may be, things that get passed. They get reversed, and it matters to 3% or 20% of the population for 2 years or for 20 years. But the point of me calling it trivial is to put it in a relative context, that in the long term of human history, the particular political issues of the election campaign of 1800. Do you remember any of them? No. How about 1900? Do you remember any of them? No. How about the year 2000? Do you remember any of them? Probably. Will you remember them in another 10 or 20 years? Probably not as well. They're just not that big a deal in the larger scheme of things. The U.S. didn't rise to superpower by political superiority. It rose by economic superiority that allowed for some political distinctions that are more or less shared by lots of other countries, frankly, which did not rise to political superpower status in the 20th century. So, those who benefit from the distraction of the masses, to those people who benefit from the distraction of the masses, the various trivial issues or relatively trivial issues may have a function that is not at all trivial. This gets back to the point of getting all those people to tune in to political ads and to get them to vote. The people who vote are then identifying themselves with that national political system, with the outcome of that campaign, with those laws. Then if the laws get passed, they're more likely to comply and obey because they've invested their attention and their emotion into a political system. So the propagandist's number one target is to produce people's identifying themselves as Canadians or Americans or Democrats or Tea Party activists or whatever. If people identify themselves politically, that's the first thing that a propagandist wants. You have to identify yourself politically in order for the propagandist's goal to be fulfilled. So people identify themselves politically with particular parties, with the particular political jurisdiction, like America or Arizona or whatever, wherever where are they registered to vote? Are they a citizen of the EU? Are they a citizen of Berlin? Where do they associate their political affiliation and their political allegiance? What labels do they use? How do they invest their consciousness, their time? What issues do they think about? So one of the most interesting quotes I learned in college about 20 years ago was, "We don't control what the masses think. We just control what they think about." So to those who benefit from the distractions of the masses from the basic issues of what propaganda is, what are the economic issues in terms of the redistribution of affluence away from Britain and Germany and Japan towards the oil-rich nations, and even away from the U.S. towards the trading partners of the U.S. that export to the U.S. Well, as far as that benefit to as far as the benefit of the propaganda to those people who are benefiting economically, well, basically, all those political distractions, all those entertainment pieces, and all that controversy, it distracts people from the economic shift. People are looking at the politics, the scandals, the dramas, the controversies. They're not looking at the simplicity of the larger economic shift. They're not looking beyond that ego identification as, well, I'm a Republican, or I'm a left-wing Christian, or a right-wing Muslim, or whatever. I'm counting all that stuff as political identification. If people have a political identification around those issues, a fundamentalism, a fanaticism, a obsession, then they're not going to look at the larger patterns. They're going to be caught up in particular issues. And every group, the Republicans have their particular pet issues. The Democrats have their pet issues, and some of them overlap, and they're pro and against. But generally, they actually have different perspectives and different worldviews, and people who identify with those worldviews fit into one of those parties, and then you have other groups besides the two major parties. But that whole mass of us against them perspective misses the fact that there is a very simple economic shift happening. It's not a financial crisis, or I'm sorry, it's not an economic crisis. It's just a financial crisis, and there's tremendous opportunity. And people who are caught up in the small-scale political issues like national politics, they'll miss the simplicity of the huge opportunity. And when I say opportunity, I just mean a redistribution. Anytime there's transactions and transfers going on, there's opportunity. When there's no exchange, no productivity, there's not much. I mean, I guess you could say there's the opportunity to begin productivity, to fill that shortage, right? If there is a demand and a shortage, then productivity can fill the shortage and be economically advantageous. All right, so we're towards the end here. For instance, a major Chinese bank, HSBC, has been benefiting from some of these financial shifts and financial crises going on. Consider that they could be. I actually didn't research this. I don't know if they are, in fact, but I do know that HSBC has been growing in the US and UK and Canada for quite a while. It's been getting bigger and bigger over time. And HSBC is a Chinese company. Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. That's what HSBC stands for, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. Below are some images of currency issued by HSBC. One's from '89, one's from, I think, 2010. And note also that Hong Kong was a British colony until recently. So these are Hong Kong dollars issued by the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, or HSBC, which is a worldwide, well, it's a international bank, and it's operating in a bunch of other countries and growing. And it says HSBC, the world's local bank. That's their relatively new slogan. I don't know how long we've had it, but that wasn't their slogan from the beginning. Of course, they didn't operate in the US or Canada or UK when they started. In fact, back in '89, when that top image is from, I don't think they had any involvement in the US at that time. So as the masses invest their attention in things like political activism and sports and, you know, whatever distractions, rather than in making simple and practical financial adjustments, creditors like HSBC increase their concentration of affluence. There's a redistribution of affluence towards creditors like HSBC and away from debtors. And here are some of the simple and practical financial adjustments categorically that I'm talking about. Prudent reallocation of investments, which means away from real estate and stocks and other bubble investments toward things that do extremely well in a deflation, or things like cash that do much better than real estate or stocks in a deflation, as well as restructuring of their finances, which would be to access the fullest advantages and protections of the current legal system in whatever jurisdiction they may be in, Canada, UK, Japan, US, whatever. In the US, especially in certain states, there are some extremely favorable laws that consumers don't know about, they don't understand. They may know about them, but they don't understand, and they don't use them, and so they don't benefit from them, and they end up having HSBC do extremely well when it could have been that that debtors and borrowers could have some protections by courts that they simply do not utilize. They don't assert. So why does the FDA promote behaviors that increase obesity and diabetes and medical addictions? This is an abrupt change of subject, kind of. Oh, I skipped a paragraph there. So focus away from the deflationary financial shift or focus toward it. But either way, there is a massive redistribution of affluence away from the debt-addicted middle class of the West and toward the creditors to whom they owe their homes, and who increasingly are the shareholders that own the companies for which the middle class of the West works. And of course, I make my reference to the oil-rich OPEC nations, but it's also the Chinese. And I don't say this with any, animosity towards the Chinese or the Asians or any particular leader or Hong Kong or HSBC. HSBC is doing what they're designed to do. They're doing it pretty well. They may not be all that successful in the long run, but in periods of time they're doing quite well. And that period has been going on for a while. And it has been distinctive, and it hasn't been noticed. I've mentioned it to people occasionally, what HSBC stands for, and most people don't find it of much interest. They don't change their behaviors. They don't research the subjects. I think they're just frightened and terrified and kind of paralyzed, and that can change. That can change suddenly. So, FDA. Why does the FDA promote behaviors that increase obesity and diabetes and medical addictions? Well, what private commercial interests lobbied for the formation of the FDA and have always directed the public policies of the FDA? The FDA promotes the behaviors they promote because the results of those behaviors benefit certain interests. Why do public schools prepare people for the lives that fit the interests of those who design and fund public education systems? Well, it's because that's what they're designed and funded to do. Why is there an immense programming of nonviolence and gun control in recent decades, and at least in the U.S.? And also you'll see some similar things in Singapore, the U.K., and so on. I saw it in Nazi Germany if you were there 60, 70 years ago. Well, it's all part of that same, it's the same trend. It's not completely different things in different places. It's one thing. It's a trend. It's part of a cyclic shift. Nonviolence is promoted at certain times by certain interests throughout human history. Just take my word for it. Nonviolence has been promoted for the monopolizing of organized violence at various times throughout human history. There have been promotions of nonviolence. You just didn't have the technological advancement of technology that you have in the last century or so. Prior to printing press and books, propaganda really didn't exist. So once you had language, and then you had written language, and then you had a printing press, that's really the origin of propaganda. So, Yuri Bezmenov, who allegedly has been evading his former employer, the KGB, for decades, he says he escaped from them and was a political refugee. I forget the word for it. Anyway, he left one country to come to another, and his life was threatened by the KGB, allegedly, and that could be true. I don't know. Anyway, he's provided some possible explanations to why would there be a programming of nonviolence and gun control and so forth in 1984 in the video linked below on the blog. By the way, note that anyone who naively trusts the absolute veracity of any former spy might not know much about the nature of organized crime syndicates or secret police agencies. They lie, even when they're telling the truth. Even when they seem like they're telling the truth, or even when they believe what they're saying, they may be presenting disinformation. That's how spy agencies go. They intentionally plant inaccurate information with some spies, or basically everything that the spy agency trains its agents to do is in the interest of the spy agency and those who fund and form them. So even if Yuri was totally sincere in this 1984 video, it may be that the KGB and those who formed and directed outside of public attention may value his publicizing of certain information. Also, in other words, why actually don't they kill him? Why does the Canadian secret, spy agencies, why do they protect him? If they do, why do they, give him political? I can't remember the word. It starts with an A. Anyway, whatever. It's not an important issue. That's kind of trivial. But the basic thing is, when the former propagandist says, "My job was deception, and now I'm going to tell you the truth," just be aware that they're a trained propagandist, and they're really good at it. And they're really good at deception. So keep in mind that in the USA, the CIA and NSA operated prior to publicity drawing attention to their operation or their influence. The existence of these agencies wasn't publicly known or promoted to the people as a referendum. The agencies were formed or were planned, they were formed, they were implemented, and over time the public was made aware of their operation and influence. Nowadays, the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, people generally don't know what it is, but it's the institution that's over the Federal Reserve and other central banks throughout the world. Many people haven't heard of it, but it's been operating for many decades and has tremendous influence. If we were to construct a model of a pyramid and put the Federal Reserve towards the top of the pyramid, the BIS would be above it, above the Federal Reserve. So propaganda is the crowning genius of the great imperialist interests. if the NSA agents claim to have higher authority than the CIA, which claims to have higher authority over the U.S. military-industrial complex as a whole, then one might ask, what interest formed and direct the NSA? Who are they the agents of? You know, who guides those who guide the masses? Well, who are we taught is both evil and, more important, defeated? Those KGB agents are rather clever, aren't they? Of course, I'm joking to suggest or imply that the KGB currently rules the world, because I consider everything as a joke that I say. I say that simply to hedge my bets and play it safe a little bit. Everything I said was a joke. Everything I said about HSBC, it's not really Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. I made that all up. That's not really true. Well, if I say that it was all a joke, that kind of gives me a little safety valve there, right? Not that anybody really cares. Anyway, though no organization that is publicly recognized to exist would ever be the heart of imperialism, of the global military-industrial imperialist empire. I just said imperialist empire. That's nice and redundant. So the BIS, they can't really be the heart of it. The Vatican, they can't really be the heart of it. The HSBC Bank, they can't really be the heart of it. It can't be a publicly recognized organization. It must be this something behind the scenes. Those who guide, those who guide, those who guide, those who guide the masses. Obviously, propagandists rule the world, and their specialty is misdirection, right? So if we had to specify an organization or an institution that rules the world, media, mass media. Now, the mass media didn't exist as such 1,000 years ago, so, you know, I don't mean to exclude the influence of militaries. Basically, there are militaries, there's kings and generals and popes and all these people who guide, and judges who send out the armed mercenaries called the sheriff deputies or the Marines or whatever. They send out their squads of folks, their gangs, their hitmen, their CIA spies, blah, blah, blah. Whoever directs all that, that's just who directs it. But those people who direct the military thing, well, are they being played by the propagandists? Or are the propagandists just a wing of the Pentagon, of the big five-sided thing at the center of the great pentagram of the religion of black magic of the United States of America? Uh-oh, I just made a reference that I didn't visually depict, and it's a visual reference. Well, you can imagine a pentagon, and if you know what a pentagram is, it's just a star with a circle inside of it, and that's the symbol on the side of like U.S. airplanes for U.S. military aircraft for the Army and stuff. It's typically it's considered a symbol of the devil or of evil or of black magic, and that's the symbol on U.S. military aircraft, and it's also the symbol used on maps for the capital city. The core of black magic, or we could say propaganda. And the Pentagon is a five-sided, 5 equal sides, five-sided thing like the center of a pentagram. Center of black magic for the whole world? I don't know if that's true, but wouldn't that be interesting? Final image in the thing under that KGB video is USA 2012 presidential campaign bipartisan anti-opposition choir. The opposition is so horrible. We agree, horribly horrible. How can they be so horrible? This is the most horrible ever. We agree, horribly horrible. Yes, they are so horrible. The campaign, it's just horrible how much negativity there is this time. How can they be so horrible? The opposition is so horrible. Yes, they are so horrible. The opposition is so horrible. The opposition is so horrible. And that is the great divide and conquer tactic of the one-eyed kings, of the black musicians, or magicians, or musicians of the propaganda rulers who guide those who guide those who guide those who guide those who guide HSBC and the masses of pro wrestling politicians. Thank you for your attention and have a pleasant holiday or Christmas, whichever comes first.